Professor Harvey J. Kaye is joining me today. He is a Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and the author and editor of numerous books, including Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great, and the latest book, FDR on Democracy. But let us not forget, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. I see hats and marketing in the future around this book, even though it's not your latest. Professor Kaye, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thank you. It is a pleasure, and it's very nice to meet you.
Yes, it's nice to meet you too. First time here on the show, and I'm happy that you're able to come on. We're hoping to give some people, first of all, before we answer the question that is the title of the show, do the Democrats actually want to save democracy? Let's give a history of, the last, say, 40, 50 years. You can pull up whatever your favorites are in terms of the things that have been undermining our democracy in the most recent past.
Several years ago, in the wake of Donald Trump's victory in 2016, and everyone was sort of worried about the threat to democracy that his presidency might well entail, it occurred to me how either people were trying to ignore the previous 40, at that point, I guess 40, 45 years, or just literally forgot it. And what I mean by that is we've already been through what was then, I think I wrote 45 years, and now we can talk about almost 50 years of what, creeping authoritarianism. I mean, nothing less than that. And what I mean is this. So back in the early 70s, it always requires going back to the 70s, okay? Always does. And for a lot of people, I don't know if you were born yet, but a lot of people listening probably weren't even born yet. And the fact is that it's in the 70s, in the wake of the struggles of the 60s and the advances made in civil rights, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, the Immigration Reform Act, the really significant regulation of capital by way of environmental protections, workplace protections, EPA, OSHA, and indeed marketplace protections, consumer protections, consumer rights, all of these things that come out of the 60s. And I'm probably forgetting quite a few other things that I could list. What happened is that capital, and these were well-documented things, in 70, 71, 72, 73, capitalists at gatherings of either their own industries or Chamber of Commerce and other places were actually bemoaning their fate. They were convinced more and more that capitalism and democracy might not be able to coexist in the fashion that it once upon a time had. And what we see is the likes of, first David Rockefeller giving a speech before, I believe he was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, obviously the famous Rockefeller family that he represented. And he spoke very openly of the fact that business and finance were under siege. And moreover, he then begins to sort of bring together a number of people, and he underwrites the creation. And as soon as I say this, everyone's going to think I'm some kind of conspiracy theorist. There's no conspiracy in what I'm going to now talk about. It was decidedly open, very public, and they even published, as my evidence, they even published a volume, The Crisis of Democracy, Report on the Governability of Democracy to the Trilateral Commission. The authors were major political science figures. And it was published by New York University Press, not some utterly, off the wall kind of operation. And what they said in there, what they said is that we were in a crisis of democracy, by which they meant that we were suffering, we, meaning the American people, and especially those who had property, wealth, and political station, they were suffering an excess of democracy. As they said, there was a democratic distemper emerging from the 1960s, and they named the culprits. They mentioned public employee unions. They talked about what was, the term at the time, minority group movements. They included the idea of a women's movement, the poor people's movement, and they threw in, for good measure, and I may be leaving out, public interest groups were decidedly on
all of these not white men.
And then they threw in the liberal media, and last but not least, the big danger too was value-oriented intellectuals, by which they meant humanities and social science professors. Engineering professors and business professors were probably fine.
They're fine.
That's one group. And by the way, that's the establishment group. It actually was an organization that included both Republicans and Democrats. No one could be holding office at the time, but I'll just note that the guy who pulled it together for Rockefeller was Zbigniew Brzezinski. First. Second of all, the two most prominent members in light of ensuing events were George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. Okay, both of whom would go on to be president. In the case of Jimmy Carter, I may exaggerate, but Jimmy Carter was David Rockefeller's candidate, crudely put.
Actually, okay? that points directly to our question that we're going to answer at the end of the segment as to whether Democrats, who historically have not necessarily, at least over the last 40, 50 years, championing democracy.
And let me say, I don't want to point a finger only at the Trilateral Commission. Let's also remember that in 1971, Lewis Powell, very prominent lawyer in Virginia, was invited by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And everyone thinks the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents small businesses. No, it's big business, okay? They invited him to go in writing as to what he saw as the dangers for business at the time. And he lays out what's called the Powell Memorandum, which anyone can find online. And it lays out the assault on business from environmentalists and other public interest groups and the whole host of folks, and the imperative of literally rallying the forces to counter that. That's the Nixon line, okay? Then, and by the way, in 2 weeks after that, he is nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court and takes his seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. Third.
Great job.
You bet. And third, emerging from all of this, once the war is declared on labor, public interests, poor people, minorities, intellectual, whatever, there's another group that seemed to have been sort of stymied, but now they emerge in the 70s as a very powerful force on the right, and that is what we call the New Right, that was brought together under the political leadership of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, all of the enemies that had already been indicated by the Nixon types, sort of the leftover Eisenhower Republicans, you could say, and indeed by the wealthiest of what people used to call liberal corporate types. He had the same lineup of enemies, of course, but he was going to reach beyond that. And of course, he ends up president as well. So that's the 70s. Now, that's the gathering of the forces. By the way, they did not all coalesce, but they all ultimately had their way because basically democracy was suppressed or at least limited. The distemper was sort of controlled. But let's not forget, first of all, you get Jimmy Carter as president, who ran further to the left than he ever lived in his life, okay, and then quickly abandoned the very people who helped to put him in the White House. And in 1978, no joke, turned his back on labor, turned his back on the environmental movement, and he turned his back on the consumer movement.
But Harvey, he put up the solar panels on the White House. Isn't that all you have to do in order to be an environmental president?
Right, I guess. So what? Okay, so that and by the way, everyone thinks of neoliberalism as a consequence of Ronald Reagan's presidency, but actually neoliberalism was launched by Jimmy Carter. If you look at his speeches in the course of 1978, when he was turning his back on the folks who put him into the White House. And by the way, the head of the UAW at the time, Douglas Frazier, who was a part of what was called the DuPont Commission, which was a commission of labor and management types, basically to always help sort of advise on industrial relations in America. Frazier quit and said, capital's declared class war on labor. I'm not going to sit in this kind of place. Well, the very same time, Carter is giving his speeches that become, well, one of which became famous as the malaise speech, in which he never actually used the word malaise. But since I went through all of those speeches of the time, I can tell you it was Carter who coined the term, it existed as a word, austerity. He actually said in 1978, it was time for austerity. And by the way, he actually exemplified it when he put on his cardigan sweater and sat before the fire and told people to turn down the thermostats. And okay. And then, of course, he literally made America
under environmentalism, right? He hid behind.
And liberals hate when I talk about this. Even progressives hate it, don't they? They say, wait a minute, this is the guy who's involved in Habitat for Humanity. Well, all well and good. He should have been involved in it in the late 70s and left the rest of us alone, because he paved the way for Ronald Reagan. He deregulated the transportation industry and began the deregulation of finance. Look, Ronald Reagan, you could say, did nothing more than what Jimmy Carter started in the late set. By the way, and I am not defending Ronald Reagan. Let me be very clear about that. And by the way, I mean, Carter was a prig, basically, not a CK. It was a self-righteous prig. He basically fired his whole cabinet one night. We all remember the Saturday Night Massacre that Nixon pulled. Well, Carter fired his whole cabinet and basically figure he'll start over again, like in the old bowling lanes, where if you're not doing well and you put a black mark over one of the frames, you say, now I'm going to start all over again, do better. But when he did that, he did worse. Okay, he did worse, which is why Teddy Kennedy sought to displace him, primaried him, and it's a tragedy in some ways. Well, Teddy Kennedy's life was a tragedy in many ways, especially for those that were affected by it. But it's also the case that Teddy Kennedy should have won the nomination, and we should have beaten Reagan. Now, before everyone says, but everyone rallied to Reagan. No, they didn't. People just didn't vote in 1980. The working class say, well, Carter's abysmal. I'm not going to vote against my own interests. So Reagan was able to win because the turnout was so low.
That sounds like history repeating itself with the Clinton. Hold on, Harvey. Yes. I'm going to ask you, do you have headphones that you can put on?
Headphones?
Yeah.
Well, I have a version of a headphone. Sure.
That'd be great. Just because I can hear my own echo, and it'll be better to.
Okay.
I'll cut this off. That's the beauty of.
Got it.
Non-live.
Okay. Then you have to make sure that I have to make sure that I can hear you because of the setting on the.
Okay.
On here. Hold on. Okay. Talk to me.
Hello. Hi, Harvey. Can you hear me?
Okay. And you hear me, right?
I can.
I haven't said anything. Good. Okay.
Okay. Let's keep talking to each other.
Okay.
Okay. We're good. Hold on. I'm going to signal myself for the later editing. And then I'm going to start you with another question. Okay.
Okay. You're holding no weapons, I can see.
No weapons. Harvey, that sounds like history repeating itself. What happened, with the Democrats running Clinton to the exclusion of the angry working class.
When I was working on the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, which is basically the story of FDR and the greatest generation, what made them truly great. And by that, I'll just say they were the most progressive generation in American history for all of their faults and failings. And without doubt, Lincoln and Roosevelt together represent the two high points of the American presidency. Let me make that clear. And then I thought I would take the book to 1945, through the New Deal years and the war years. And my editor said, no. I'm going to say something. You may want to cut it. I don't know. He said, no. You got to tell us what the fuck happened. I'll leave it to you how you want to handle that.
We'll leave that right in there. Our people like that.
Okay, fine, because that's exactly, in fact, my editor tantalized me with the prospect of titling the concluding chapter, What the Fuck Happened? and then told me eventually that he was just basically having me on because he wanted to make sure I wrote the chapter. Okay.
Yes.
And the writing of that chapter, it takes, here's the thing. So what we see is after Roosevelt's death, of course, the progressive politics is stymied, but it is resurrected in the 1960s by way of the children of the greatest generation pushing their parents. And the Congress of the 60s were the 15-year-olds of 1935 and the veterans of World War II. And as I said, they passed all of these very progressive laws. Okay. And then he really pushed my editor, said, no, you got to take us right up to Reagan. Okay. So what I began in the 70s is truly what we saw. And this is now, I can encapsulate what we saw, is that it was the beginning of the war, class war and culture wars on the democratic achievements of the 1930s through 1970, 71. So that it's the generation that confronted and beat the Depression, the generation that fought fascism in World War II and prevailed, and along the way radically and dramatically transformed the United States. And all I have to mention is Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act, the transformation of the environment. I mean, over and over again, they made history in a way that was truly American. And that same young generation, whatever their faults and failings, I'm very happy to acknowledge this, in the 1960s, they literally elected the most liberal Congress imaginable in the day, and they passed all these reforms. And then in the 70s, what do we get? We get folks who should have celebrated what they had achieved, literally declaring war on all of those achievements, which included the achievements of a younger generation, and not my own necessarily. I'm not going to be chauvinistic about it, but I was somewhat a part of it. And the fact is that 30s to the 60s, and Carter went after, in some ways, that democratic distemper, as they called it, and Reagan then literally was handed the torch of the war and pursued it all the more aggressively. And then Clinton, Clinton becomes the neoliberal president. Barack Obama, I know people don't like to hear it, was the next neoliberal president. And if it wasn't for the fact that Republicans hated him so much, he would have given the whole store away. He opened up and said, no, forget. And he literally got off without having to give up, cutting into Social Security, etc. What do we end up with? Well,
Trump.
we ended up with Trump. You got it. Yeah. And
Well,
if
here
Trump
we are.
hadn't, yeah.
And
look where we
Biden,
are.
I mean, Biden has recently said that our democracy is in peril. And you just gave us a good reason to ask the following question. I've heard you identify as an FDR Democrat and talk about how the Democrats need to save democracy and what Biden needs to do. He needs to pass his infrastructure bill, et cetera. But, it's safe to say that the Democrats have been, to put it kindly, complicit in the demise of democracy. What makes you think that they as a party are truly motivated to actually preserve it?
Okay. Well, I never actually said that.
No, I know. I'm just saying. I'm just wondering.
Right. Well, my thinking is, for a start, is that right now we have to work with what we've got. But every day that passes, I mean, if you went back to listen to my performance on radio and elsewhere over these last 6 months, you'd see the tone of my voice changing quite a bit. I actually had believed for some time that Bernie was going to be so influential. I mean, look, Ron Klain and others started talking about, Ron Klain, the chief of staff in the Biden administration, they started talking about FDR. This is we heard that when Obama was elected too, by the way, the resurrection of FDR. And we saw in the first effort, the rescue plan, I think it was called the American Rescue Plan or something like that. We saw something of a counterpart to what FDR had in mind in the initial relief efforts during the Depression, during 1933 into 34. Okay, so but as I said to people back then, we are in a crisis not unlike the crisis of the 1770s that entailed a revolution, the 1860s that entailed literally Americans in all their diversity backing Lincoln to bring an end to slavery. And I mean both slaves and northern farmers and artisans. And in the 1930s, the FDR coalition that literally empowered the working class in a way it had never been empowered before, and turned the United States into the strongest and most prosperous nation. Because not unlike the 1770s and the 1860s, the story of America is, in the face of daunting crises, mortal crises, you go radical. That's the way you save America. So I thought maybe, just maybe, Bernie, who doesn't talk enough about history himself, might have had some influence in that administration. And we saw a sort of FDR initiative to open, and we saw the projection of a series of FDR initiatives. However, we also heard a president who talked more about unity than solidarity. We've had a president who constantly talks about the soul of America, which comes out of a book by John Meacham, who, by the way, warned Obama not to go too progressive or he might lose his own presidency. I mean, what we've got here is hardly makings of a truly progressive and decidedly not radical transformation of America. So democracy is you bet American democracy is in crisis. My fantasy was that at his inaugural address, Biden would apologize for ever having been a neoliberal. I've seen, maybe, like, I've seen the light. I realize, something along those lines. Okay. Not to mention, he promised to absolve students of those massive debts they have. He talked about, and if not, he didn't talk about Medicare for all, but he promised he was going to truly enhance care, Obamacare programs. I mean, yeah. So wait. So it would be nice. It would be nice for a start if the Democrats apologized. Ain't going to happen. Okay. But even worse is the fact that they just don't get it. They don't even get what democracy is, because if they did, they would have literally confronted and mobilized America. Look, confronted and mobilized Americans against the neoliberals many, many years ago. Okay. So I've always tried to remain hopeful, and I'm grabbing for the last possibility.
Well, you've talked about in other interviews. I heard you on Nicole Sandler. I think it was earlier this week or last week. What day is it?
Yeah, last week. Right.
Last week you were on Nicole Sandler, and we talked about how passing the infrastructure plan would be one good step toward preserving democracy. Can you talk about why that's important?
Yeah, well, let's acknowledge the fact that, given the fact that Manchin and possibly Sinema and possibly the two Democrats from senators from Delaware and the two Democratic senators from New Hampshire, who are hiding behind the skirt of Manchin, that they might all oppose anything significant like the For the People Act. And by the way, the For the People Act, it would just literally restore voting rights and enable us to move forward on the question. We desperately also need the PRO Act, the Workers' Rights Act. That's essential. You want to save democracy, you've got to have both. But we're not going to see either one, apparently. So what do I do? Okay, so I think, well, what's a way of at least of holding on against the Republicans? How do you do that? Well, the infrastructure bill, okay, the infrastructure. So that, what would that entail? It would literally entail, at least in one of the two sections, they've divided it in two, right? The family plan. And the point is, you have to create a massive program that will provide jobs. And by doing that, you're not only going to have boots on the ground, so to speak, of people who appreciate what this administration is doing, you're going to do something else. And this is the crucial thing. First of all, you're going to, along the way, empower Biden, if he has any sincerity in his desire to reflect an FDR-like mindset. You're going to empower him to sign certain things in executive orders that would make the Infrastructure Act the replacement for the things we can't have. So, for example, he could sign an executive order saying that any company, that any individual who is working on an infrastructure project funded by the federal government must receive at least, in fact, you ought to go further than what I'm about to say, $15 an hour first. Second of all, they should all be guaranteed Medicare, some kind of national health care plan. Okay. And third, that they are all entitled to organize and bargain collectively. Now, he can do that. The executive pen enables that. Now, of course, you'll say, well, but then it could all come to an end eventually. But you know what? People might not.
Once people get a taste of it.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Look, who would have, people thought that the Republicans could overturn Social Security way back when. But as Eisenhower said, any party that, well, by the way, Eisenhower was half wrong when he said this, but he told his brother, who was urging him to be a real conservative, and his own press secretary, when he talked about what they needed to do, he said, any party, this is 1954, any party that tries to end Social Security, okay, reduce the rights of workers, to organize unions, tries to cut the subsidies to farmers. He laid out the whole New Deal and said, anyone who tries to get rid of the New Deal, that party will never be heard from again. Well, they did kill labor rights in too many parts of the country. They did, in fact, do many a thing to kill the New Deal. However, this is it. Social Security remains, if you like, sacred. Okay. The problem is that Biden and other neoliberal Democrats went after the additional elements of Social Security. They went after Medicare, and the like. I mean, people should realize Medicare is what is literally Johnson's effort to try to open the door to universal health care, because that is what FDR wanted back in the 30s. And by the way, in 1943 and 44, 85% of Americans wanted a guarantee of health care.
One of your recent books talks about how we need to take the narrative back and remind people that what being American actually is about. And you talk can you talk a little bit about the origins of American exceptionalism, this idea and this term, and how it's been twisted to something unrecognizable?
Yeah, undeniably, I mean, it's hard for me to defend the term American exceptionalism because everyone I know on the left says, "What are you talking about? You're handing it over." I said, no. That has been hijacked along with the entire story of what we think of as the United States of America. So exceptional. My hero ever since I was a 10-year-old was Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine talked about American exceptionalism in terms of it was the first opportunity that humanity had to create a democratic republic and to guarantee the kinds of things that we now, or at least used to take for granted. Okay. That's the same Thomas Paine who later literally outlines a social security plan in the 1790s, okay, which I can get into another time if you want to talk about it. The point is that the American Revolution was a revolution. For, again, it left too much undone. It empowered folks who were more than willing to marginalize women, sustain slavery, and so on. But it was a revolution that literally did turn the world upside down. In 1861, in the Civil War, that was a war not simply to sustain the republic, which, by the way, was essential if you ever wanted to get rid of slavery, because if the South succeeded in seceding, they already had made it clear that slavery was natural in the white supremacist mind. Lincoln says to Americans, as slaves are running to the Union lines, as farmers and artisans who have now entered into the war see the devastation that slavery wreaks upon humanity. He said to the American people, didn't have TV and radio, but he said in his address to Congress that he delivered, he said, "Fellow citizens, we know what we must do." And he reminds Americans that if they're going to sustain the republic, the United States, they have to go radical. He said, "We know what we have to do. The entire world knows what we have to do. We have to bring an end to slavery." In fact, he says, and we do it not for the slave alone. We do it for ourselves, because one of the things Lincoln realized is there was no rule in place that said only blacks could be enslaved, since there was no such real thing. Whatever people think about his racialism, Lincoln was pretty smart in realizing that it was a color of skin question ultimately, and what would have prevented them from literally just lining people up and choosing who could fit under that category. So literally a war that began as a sustaining of the Union, Lincoln finally gets his opportunity and he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. 250,000 African Americans enter into the Union Army. The North wins the Civil War. And then in the 30s, so what I'm talking about here is what makes America exceptional, as I've sort of talked about regarding the 30s and the Depression as well, is this. In the face of a mortal crisis, Americans have somehow found it in themselves, against their own mentalities in many cases, to go radical. And I don't actually know of any other nation on earth that can lay claim to that kind of exceptional story. And so it's the radicalism that runs through America, I think, and especially exhibited in the 1770s, the 1860s, and the 1930s, that affords us certain exceptionalism. Unfortunately, conservatives hijacked the idea. They completely write off the whole idea of radicalism, actually. But what's worse is liberals and even the left have turned their back on that American story all too often. When's the last time you ever heard a liberal or progressive Democrat lay claim to American history and literally try to take back the story of America? Not even Bernie Sanders did it. Who, by the way, has been my political hero for decades, but pissed me off regularly because he literally did not lay claim to American history.
Why do you think he didn't do that?
You know, that's a
I mean, he
tough.
did have enough time. He gave the same speech like 1,000 times. We
Yes.
want to hear more from Bernie, but not the same thing.
Right. Well, yeah. Billionaires. Denmark. Give me a break already, okay?
What
How
percent?
about how about Thomas Paine? How about Frederick Douglass? How about Abraham Lincoln? You know what? You know the final debate between Bernie and Biden? You remember that debate? The night before that he was set up to possibly go FDR publicly again. He never did this on national TV. He had something they jokingly referred to as an online YouTube fireside chat. Mm-hmm. The next day, an hour before the debates were to take place, Brianna Joy Gray, his press secretary, lines up a whole series of activities and events. And I think actually kind of projected the possibility that FDR would be called into the room, that Bernie would actually talk about FDR's call for an economic bill of rights. I was so waiting. I had already been pissed off enough that every time he debated his fellow Democrat, he wasn't a Democrat, but his fellow Democratic candidates, instead, that whenever they charged him with being ready to bankrupt the nation with Medicare for all, he didn't turn to them and say, "You have the audacity to call yourselves Democrats?" Mm-hmm. And then turn, as Eugene Debs did in 1918 when defending himself against charges of sedition, and bring into the room the American radical tradition one by one. Well, FDR could have been called in. Bernie could have called in FDR and literally lifted the FDR legacy and smacked them down. And he didn't do it. That would have been good.
But I think that he didn't do it because, you know, if he wasn't going to be the candidate, he was going to have to turn around and say, but Biden is better than Trump, you know, which is what he did. So he couldn't go too hard. I mean, maybe he could have found a better way to do exactly that and bring that up. This country was founded on, you know,
Julianna, blah, blah, blah. I know what you're saying, but I'll give you the alternative scenario. The alternative scenario is this, is he should have turned to Joe and said, "Joe, we've been friends for years. I'd be happy to see you president before Donald Trump anytime. But if you're going to become president, let's face facts. We are in an unprecedented crisis. Democracy itself is at stake. Now is the time not simply to go big, but to go big as FDR did. And hell, he could have thrown in Lincoln's name too. Now is the time to empower American working people once again. Because it's not going to be a top-down big. It's got to be an equally bottom-up kind of. He could have talked like that. And by the way, I do want you to know, I'm gonna tell this, okay? I won't name names in this, but I'm gonna say something.
Name the names.
Well, I got called by a major progressive publisher and editor, okay, who was going to be interviewing Bernie after the convention. And this person asked me, "What would you like to ask Bernie?" This is back in 2016. Okay. Now I'm forgetting if it's 2016 or 2020. May have been 2016. The point is that I got to ask, by way of a third party, Bernie, why do you not grab hold of American? Why do you not talk about American history? Only at two occasions in the course of his two campaigns did he really go big into history, when he talked about FDR and the Economic Bill of Rights. And he did it, by the way, first at Georgetown back in 2015, and then at George Washington University 2014, which, by the way, his advisors screwed him on that. He should have gone to a public university, the University of Maryland, not to the two most expensive kinds of universities in the United States. He should have, because he was trying to promote the idea of free public higher education. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there he did talk about Economic Bill of Rights. And then when people asked him on my behalf, basically he said, "I don't want to talk about history. I don't want to talk about that." He blew it off. So what am I going to say? Okay. I mean, I was not prepared to blow him off. I mean, he was my guy. I've admired Bernie since the 1980s. I think he probably
knows how much education has been undermined, and that many of our students do not know anything about FDR and the FDR years. So if you call, I mean, you can say George Washington and you could say Abraham Lincoln, but that's about it in terms of people knowing details about.
I have a counter for you.
Point in time.
I have a counter for you.
Go.
He already had the younger vote. He needed the older vote. And the older vote knew
They went to a decent
FDR.
school. Yes. Okay. That's before school. That's when social studies was still taught. Yes.
But it really, I mean, the big question I constantly ask is, why are the Democrats, have left historians so obsessively pursued the deconstruction of American history? That is, revealing, the exploitation, the oppression, the tragedy, and the irony, all of which needed to be revealed. But has it been the case that they were so effective in doing that, that literally they scared off liberal and progressive politicians from even talking about American history for fear they'll get canceled? And what I'm telling you is that has cost us tremendously. I'll tell you something else. Yeah, I don't know.
Also, wait, hold on. Let me squeeze something in here because keep going. This is great.
Yeah.
A lot of the journalists and online reporters who who are liberals and criticizing the Democrats from the left, I think, what do you think about the damage that they do? Because the Democrats are the only party we have right now to get rid of fascism. Even though they're creeping toward that themselves by kind of going over the center
months ago, I said, and I may have disappointed. I know he did. So I've done a number of video shows with Jacobin. Okay.
Oh yeah, sure.
And and Jacobin's the foremost socialist magazine in the United States. Many a Marxist behind it, and I did 4 of them, basically on American history, kinds of things that we've talked about here. And somebody actually said to me, and with other people as well, they said, well, what should be our position? How should we approach the Biden administration? That might, and I said, well, there's no use in declaring war on it. Don't declare war on it. I mean, it's not only a case. Look, the liberals and progressives, let alone, the socialists had their own. We're talking, what are we going to do? The fact is that we need the kind of social democratic stuff that Biden is hinting at. Mm-hmm. Push him. Yes. Number one. And 2, push him not in a way that threatens him. Push him in a way that says, we're all in this together on the left. In my book, Take Hold of Our History, by the way, the one that I had sort of behind me here, which is a collection of my speeches and essays of the last 10 years, now a dozen years. The fact is that I called there for what existed in the 1930s, a popular front of liberals, progressives, radicals, and socialists. Okay, we were in the kind of crisis that required a broad left unity. The resistance is one thing. Resistance was just literally you're holding on for your life. No, the fact is now was the time, because there was a chance of displacing these folks from the White House and Congress. Now is the time to start pushing a united front on the left built around the ideas of social democracy.
Harvey, have you been to Left Forum? These people want to. I'm sorry. I've been.
I know what you're saying. Well, somebody had to raise the possibility.
And be angry and not. I feel sometimes like the left is against unity, even though they are. If you get the labor left, they understand what unity is. But the left is just so mad that Marx said this and that the other guy said that, and they're all going to have a conversation with I don't think unity is their thing, to be honest.
Well, obviously not, but that doesn't mean that somebody like myself isn't gonna say the imperative exists in that way. Okay,
but is it possible?
Look, I'm worried about this stuff. I saw this unfold for 45 years. This kind of knee-jerk leftism. Okay, that a knee-jerk leftism that might have been able to rally to some extent around Bernie, but God forbid Elizabeth Warren had been selected. Okay. Who look, the only difference between Bernie Sanders, you know what I'm going to say? Bernie, they said Bernie's a socialist and Warren's a progressive. If you looked at what they were about, they were both social democrats. The difference was that Warren didn't have the courage to say socialism, and Bernie made the dumb mistake of constantly preaching socialism. They were both FDR Democrats.
Yeah.
Be honest to the American people.
Yes.
By the way, you just got me going. And if I were on another hour, I'd say a hell of a lot more. I'm going to be careful.
I really like where this is going, though.
I'll tell you something which, I always hesitate to do this.
I'm not going to cut you off.
I worry about this younger generation's conception of the American promise. Say the American promise, and they say, well, it was all a hoax. Well, no, it wasn't. The very first people who grabbed hold of the Declaration to try to secure their freedom were black slaves in New England. Okay. Women in 1848 gathered and began the struggle for women's rights by literally rewriting the Declaration of Independence into all men and women are created equal. Labor unionists, working men's party in the early part of the century, they grabbed hold of Thomas Paine and the Declaration. Frederick Douglass, okay, a self-emancipated slave who became the greatest orator in the 19th century and the foremost figure in the abolitionist movement, wrote a sermon that he delivered, I think it was on July 5th, maybe the day after July 4th. And he asked the question to his audience of presumably predominantly white abolitionists, what to the slave is the 4th of July? Mm-hmm. And he spends much of the sermon or speech laying out all the reasons he would have to despise America, okay, for the enslavement of his fellow African Americans and himself originally. And then at the end, he then literally shifts and says, and yet, this is a promise, okay? He knew that's the promise, okay? And he literally embraces, in a most patriotic way, that American promise. In fact, I used to do a game with my students. I would tell them, this is your weekend assignment. Read What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And your only thing you have to worry about is answering one question, but then offer evidence. Is Frederick Douglass a patriot or an antagonist to the United States? And by the way, the answer was obvious. I knew who read it or not. So like those who stopped halfway through and said, oh, this guy's an antagonist.
At the title. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The ones who went to the end realized the answer was obvious. So it was just, read it. But to come back to it, over and over again, the way in which the left in all its forms, progressives and radicals and liberals and socialists, the way in which they've advanced freedom, equality, and democracy is not by rejecting the American promise, by once again lay claiming to it. But when's the last time you heard people do that?
Not in a while. And actually, people who do that, especially given I'm just pulling from my own experience of having worked in some far left areas. Like, I as I was saying before, it just seems like attack is on the rise. If you call for unity, you are called unaware of the XYZ marginalized group's struggle. And I'm like, well, I'm not unaware of it, and I'm from certain groups too. Like, we all need to
right,
live in the present moment, put the past aside. If all of us could join together, we could
overthrow. But don't put the past aside. That's my point.
Well, I know, but I think we have to put some of the past aside.
We have to transcend. We have to remember it and transcend it. And the best way to do that, look, if we want to win,
transcend is a good word. No one wants to put their past aside.
Think about it this way. I think too often we on the left get too much pleasure in literally bad-mouthing. I think it's great. Anger, but anger is not going to get you. It'll motivate you, but you have got to learn to speak to your fellow citizens who, by the way, may not be aware of what we're aware of, who may not be as concerned about the story of exploitation, oppression, etc. However, I got to tell you something. They did studies back in the 90s. They did surveys back in the 90s. It didn't get a lot of attention. It ended up in academic books that showed that actually when you asked Americans to give you a thumbnail narrative of America, this was done, by the way, at the University of Virginia. So I can assure you it wasn't only Massachusetts citizens who were asked this or whatever, or New York progressives. They asked people to give them, to explain. And over again, they all laid out a generally progressive narrative, which involved the idea of struggling to secure things. Now, the left doesn't talk to those kind of folks. The left is too educated. They think everybody else doesn't get it. What I meant
about the left having to, forget their past is that if everyone who is working in one of these far left organizations can just assume that everyone else who's working there It's probably going to be on your side if you were the target of injustice and you've been fighting against that and fighting to overcome it. It's just this circular firing squad in an area where people generally do have each other's best interests at heart, when everyone can sit down and kind of let rational minds take hold. I think that would do a lot.
And I want to make something clear. To the credit of Jacobin, the socialist magazine, they asked me to talk just like that as I'm talking to you, one. And two, if you read many of the articles, they're trying to reclaim American history. So there are those folks out there. Okay. Now, would they have subscribed to a popular front of the left? I don't know. I didn't get to ask them that question, but next time I meet with someone, I'll do that. But it's getting a bit late. It's getting a bit late.
It is getting a bit late. Well, there's so much more we can talk about, and I do appreciate you staying far over the time that I had asked you to come, so I thank you very much for that. We're speaking with Harvey J. Kaye, Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice Studies. Don't forget to subscribe to ACT.TV, which is what you're watching, and you can follow Harvey on Twitter at Harvey J. Kaye, as in J the letter, and then Kaye. The name, I'm sure you've had to say that.
Yes, right. People sometimes say, why do you make such a big deal of your middle initial? And I can tell you, there are other Harvey Kays out there, one of whom used to write about life from business perspective.
Oh, yeah.
And another one who wrote about sort of manhood questions. I used to get women's magazines calling me, did I want to talk about manhood? And I said, yeah, but I don't think I'm the guy you want to talk to.
Oh, you should have just pretended and been like, what's manhood? Fighting for women's rights out in the street. Harvey, you missed an opportunity.
Yeah, right. So yes, it's Harvey, initial J, Kaye, with an E on the end.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Julianna. It's been a pleasure.
Come back another time and we'll continue our discussion.
Happily. Just ask. Happily.
You're watching ACT.TV. Thanks so much for watching.